The Devils by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Just before starting part 1, he leaves a quote from the Bible, Luke chapter 8, verses 32 through 36. And it reads, "And there was there an herd of many swine feeding on the mountain, and they besought him that he would suffer them to enter into them. And he suffered them. Then went the devils out of the man, and entered into the swine. And the herd ran violently down a steep place into the lake, and were choked. When they that fed them saw what was done, they fled and went and told it in the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what was done, and came to Jesus, and found the man out of whom the devils were departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. They also which saw it told them by what means he that was possessed of the devils was healed." Alright, part 1. By way of an introduction, a few details from the biography of the greatly esteemed Stepan Trofimovich Verkovensky. Before describing the extraordinary events which took place so recently in our town, hitherto not remarkable for anything in particular, I find it necessary, since I am not a skilled writer, to go back a little and begin with certain biographical details concerning our talented and greatly esteemed Stepan Trofimovich Verkovensky. I hope these details will serve as an introduction to the social and political chronicle of our town, while the story I have in mind to relate will come later. Let me say at once that Mr. Verkovensky had always played a rather special and, as it were, civic role amongst us, and that he loved that role passionately, so much so that I cannot help feeling that he would not have been able to exist without it. Not that I have any intention of comparing him to an actor on the stage, God forbid, particularly as I have the utmost respect for him. Perhaps it was all just a matter of habit, or better still, it may have been the result of a constant and generous desire from his earliest years of indulging in the agreeable fancy of being a famous public figure. For instance, he was very fond of his position as a marked man, or as it were, an exile. There is a sort of classical splendor about those two words that fascinated him, raising him gradually in his own estimation in the course of years, finally led him to imagine himself as standing on a high pedestal, a position that was very gratifying to his vanity. In an English satirical novel of the last century, a certain Gulliver, on his return from the country of the Lilliputians, where all the people were only 3 or 4 inches tall, had grown so accustomed to look upon himself as a giant that even as he walked in the streets of London, he could not help shouting at the carriages and the passers-by to get out of his way and take heed he did not crush them, imagining that they were little and that he was still a giant, but that merely made everybody laugh at him and abuse him. And the uncouth coachmen even belabored the giant with their whips. But was that fair? What does habit not do to a man? Habit had brought Mr. Verkovensky almost to the same position, though in a more innocent and inoffensive form, if one may put it that way, for he was a most excellent man. As a matter of fact, I cannot help thinking that towards the end of his life he was completely forgotten by everybody. But on the other hand, it would be absurd to say that he was entirely unknown. Indeed, there cannot be any doubt at all that for some time he too belonged to the famous galaxy of illustrious men of the last generation, and that at one time, though only for the briefest moment, his name was uttered by many enthusiastic people of that day, almost in the same breath as Sharayev, Belinsky, Granovsky, and Herzen, who had only just begun his activities abroad. But Mr. Verkovensky's activities came to an end almost as soon as they began, as a result of, so to speak, a whirlwind of concurrent events. And what do you think? It turns out afterwards that there had been no whirlwind and even no events, at any rate at that particular instant. It was only the other day that I discovered, to my great astonishment, from a highly reliable source, that Mr. Verkovensky had never lived in our province amongst us as an exile, as we were all led to suppose, and that he had never been placed under police supervision, which only goes to show how vivid one's imagination can be. For all his life he sincerely believed that he was regarded with apprehension in certain quarters, that every step of his was known and watched, and that each of our 3 governors who succeeded one another during the last 20 years brought with him, as he arrived to rule over our province, a certain preconceived idea about him that had been suggested from above, and most certainly on his appointment as governor. Had anyone tried to convince our most fair-minded Mr. Verkovensky by irrefutable evidence that there was nothing he need be afraid of, he would most certainly have been deeply offended. And yet he was undoubtedly a highly intelligent and talented man, a man who was, as it were, even a scholar, though so far as his scholarship was concerned, well, he did not really make any important contribution to scholarship. Indeed, none at all, I believe. But then, that happens again and again in Russia with men of learning. On his return from abroad, he distinguished himself as a university lecturer towards the very end of the 40s, but he had only time to deliver a few lectures about the Arabs, I think. He had time to defend a brilliant thesis on the civic and Hanseatic importance of the little German town of Hanau during the period between 1413 and 1428, and simultaneously on the special and rather obscure reasons why that promise was never fulfilled. This thesis was a shrewd and painful blow at the Slavophiles of the day, and at once made him innumerable and bitter enemies among them. Later on, that was after he had lost his position at the university, he managed to publish by way of revenge and just to show them what a man that he had lost. In a monthly progressive periodical, which translated Dickens and propagated the ideas of George Sand, the beginning of a most profound work of research into the causes, I believe, of the extraordinary moral nobility of certain knights of a certain epoch, or something of the kind. Anyway, it expounded some exceedingly lofty and extraordinarily noble idea. It was rumored afterwards that he was hastily forbidden to carry on with his research, and that the progressive periodical even came to grief for having published the first part. That may well have been so, for what did not happen in those days. But in this particular case, it is much more likely that nothing of the sort happened, and that the author himself was too lazy to finish the essay. He stopped his lectures on the Arabs because someone, probably one of his reactionary enemies, had somehow or other intercepted a letter to someone giving an account of certain circumstances, as a result of which someone else had demanded some kind of explanation from him. I don't know whether it is true, but it was also asserted that just then there was discovered in Petersburg a certain vast subversive anti-government society of 13 members, which very nearly undermined the foundations of the state. It was whispered that they intended to translate the works of Fourier himself. It so happened that at the very moment the authorities in Moscow seized Mr. Verkovensky's poetic play, written 6 years before in Berlin, when he was still very young, and circulated in manuscript among two literary dilettanti and one student. That play is lying now on my table. I received it about a year ago from Mr. Verkovensky, who had only recently copied it out in his own hand. It bears his own autograph and is bound in magnificent red morocco. I must admit that it is not without poetic merit and even some talent. It is strange, but in those days, that is, in the 30s, people often wrote that kind of poetic drama. I am rather at a loss to tell you what it is all about, because, to be frank, I can't make head or tail of it. It is some sort of allegory in lyrical and dramatic form, recalling the second act of Faust. It opens with a chorus of women, followed by a chorus of men, then a chorus of some spirits, and lastly a chorus of souls which have never lived but which are very anxious to live. All these choruses sing about something very indefinite, mostly about somebody's curse, but with a suggestion of the loftiest humor. Then the scene suddenly changes, and a sort of festival of life begins, in which even insects join in the scene. A tortoise appears with certain sacramental Latin words, and if I remember rightly, even some mineral, that is quite an inanimate object, also bursts into song about something or the other. In fact, they all sing incessantly, and when they speak they seem to abuse each other vaguely, but again with a suggestion of some higher meaning. At last the scene changes again into a blasted heath, and a cultured young man wanders among the rocks, picking and sucking herbs. Asked by a fairy why he sucks those herbs, he replies that, feeling a superabundance of life in himself, he seeks forgetfulness and finds it in the juice of those herbs. but that his dearest wish is to lose his reason as soon as possible, a wish that seems to be quite superfluous. Then a young man of indescribable beauty suddenly comes riding in on a black horse, followed by a vast concourse of all the nations. The young man symbolizes death, and all the nations yearn for it. And finally, in the last scene of all, the Tower of Babel appears, and some athletes at last finish building it with a song of new hope. And when they reach the top of the Lord of Olympus, I suppose, runs off in a comic fashion, and mankind, realizing the position and seizing his place, at once began a new life with a new insight into things. It was that sort of poetic play that was considered dangerous in those days. Last year, I proposed to Mr. Verkovensky to publish it, since it would be regarded as utterly innocuous nowadays. But he declined my suggestion with unconcealed displeasure. My view of its utter innocuousness did not please him, and I even ascribed to it a certain coldness in our relations, which lasted 2 whole months. And what do you think? All of a sudden, and almost at the same time as I had proposed publishing it here, the play was published there. That is to say, abroad in one of the revolutionary miscellanies, and entirely without Mr. Verkovensky's knowledge. At first, he was alarmed, rushed off to see the governor, and wrote a most loyal letter in his self-defense to Petersburg, which he read to me twice, but never posted, not knowing to whom to address it. In short, he was very agitated for a whole month, but I am convinced that deep down in his heart he was greatly flattered. He almost went to bed with a copy of the journal which someone had obtained from him, and in the daytime he kept it hidden under the mattress. He would not even permit his maidservant to make his bed, and though he daily expected the arrival of a telegram, he viewed the world at large with a scornful eye. It was just then that he made friends with me again, which is merely another proof of the extreme kindliness of his gentle and unresentful heart. That was chapter 1, I think, of part 1.